Batman is a character who is no stranger to the darker side of superhero comics. Ever since his creation in 1939, the Caped Crusader has featured in countless stories that infuse his heroic adventures with aspects of horror, pulp and noir, as well as his frequent battles with not only fantastical and high-concept villains, but also the most heinous corners of humanity. Especially in the past 40 years, there have been many comics that explore these aspects of the aptly named Dark Knight, from Frank Miller's Year One and The Dark Knight Returns, Alan Moore's The Killing Joke, 90s epics like No Man's Land and Nightfall, and even more modern tales like The Court of Owls, all seek to push the hero to his psychological brink. However, if I was to name the darkest Batman comic, and the one I think went the furthest to shock readers and deconstruct this beloved character, it wouldn't be any of the iconic books I just listed. Instead, my answer would be a 4-issue miniseries published by DC in 1988, titled Batman: The Cult. Published between August and November of 1988, written by Jim Starlin with art by Bernie Wrightson, The Cult is one of the most shocking and polarising tales to ever feature the Caped Crusader. Throughout its 4-issue run, Starlin and Wrightson push Batman to his absolute limits, testing his physical, mental and spiritual breaking points to an extent never seen on the printed page. As you might imagine, The Cult has garnered a notable legacy in the 37 years since its creation, and so in this video, I want to explore the history behind this series, consider how it came to be and its place within this era of the Dark Knight's comics, and examine how the Cult goes further to deconstruct and unravel Batman than arguably any story published before or since. Before we continue though, just a quick reminder to leave a like on this video if you enjoy it, and subscribe to Owen Likes Comics so you don't miss out on any future videos. Before we dive into the Cult itself, I think it's worth giving some context for the state of Batman's comics at the time of its release, as well as a brief overview of the creative team responsible for this shocking tale. The 1980s was a monumental decade for Batman, with his big budget live action film firmly on the horizon and DC rebooting their entire continuity in 1986 with Crisis on Infinite Earths. This decade was a period of notable reinvention for the Caped Crusader, as numerous writers and artists tried to craft their unique take on this long-standing character and define what Batman would be for the next generation. In February of 1986, Frank Miller and Klaus Janson kickstarted this with the release of the first issue of what would become The Dark Knight Returns. Throughout its subsequent 4-issue run, this comic revolutionised how fans viewed Batman, with Miller transplanting Bruce Wayne into a hellish dystopian world, one that not only mirrored the real-world anxieties of contemporary America and the Cold War, but also showcased a much older Dark Knight being forced to return to save his city from the clutches of both new and old foes. To say The Dark Knight Returns was impactful would be a colossal understatement. Chances are if you're watching this video, you're well aware of the comic's significance and impact on the wider genre still to this day. But what's worth noting is that Miller's dark, dystopian and hyper-violent take on Batman would set a precedent that many future writers would try to follow. A year later, Miller teamed with artist David Mazzucchelli for Year One, told within the pages of Batman issue 404 to 407, this new canonical origin story reasserted the hero's dark and gritty roots, bringing a grounded, neo-noir infused approach to Dark Knight Returns' bombastic and blockbuster offering. The combination of these two stories created an archetype that almost every subsequent Batman writer sought to build upon. In 1987, Mike Barr and Alan Davis published Batman Year 2, and that same year, Jason Todd, the second Robin, was reintroduced as a troubled street kid recruited by Batman after trying to steal the Batmobile's tyres. The following March, Batman the Killing Joke by Alan Moore and Brian Bolland hit shelves. This now infamous one-shot not only retold the Joker's origins, but focused on his efforts to mentally break Batman and his long-serving ally, Commissioner Gordon, and also saw Barbara Gordon aka Batgirl become paralysed. These comics are all essential to understanding the development and approach taken within the Cult, as they all exist within this period of writers was intentionally trying to tell darker and more deconstructive stories with the Caped Crusader. Jim Starlin was no stranger to the world of superheroes by the mid to late 1980s. Having first made his name working on Captain Marvel in the 1970s, Starlin became a major player at Marvel Comics, creating such celebrated characters as Thanos and Shang-Chi, and telling now renowned stories like 1982's The Death of Captain Marvel. Despite his time at Marvel focusing mainly on telling space and cosmic-centered stories, Starlin was hired by Denny O'Neil to take over writing Batman, initially as a fill-in writer before being hired to pen the ongoing series. Starlin's debut issue, Batman issue 414, saw him team with artist Jim Aparo. In his first handful of issues, Starlin crafted a murder mystery story that saw Batman investigate a serial killer who leaves his victims in dumpsters across Gotham. These issues are brutal, with Batman and Robin emerging from their usual status quo to grapple with the harsh reality of murder and violence within the city. Starlin's take on Batman was immediately recognisable from these issues, offering a more hard-boiled and street-level approach that forced the character to move beyond the world of costumed villains and deal with genuine horrors that felt uncomfortably real. Alongside this, Starlin added a more prominent socio-political lens to Batman too, with his next major story arc, 10 Nights of the Beast, which introduced the Russian mercenary KG Beast as he tries to assassinate then US President Ronald Reagan. While all of these stories were somewhat ambitious in nature, The Cult would be Starlin's most unapologetically out there Batman tale yet. Teaming with Swamp Thing co-creator Bernie Wrightson, he crafted a story that saw Batman both encounter and succumb to the most unnerving and unsettling corners of humanity, all while seeking to comment on both the increasingly dark turn that superhero comics were going in and the long-standing moral panic against superheroes that had existed in America since the 1940s and 50s. In the introduction to the collection edition of The Cult, Starlin explains his inspiration behind the story, stating that
the 80s brought on a more adult version of comics. Writers leaped at the chance to expand the depths of the imaginary characters they'd grown up with and whose destinies they now directed. Some pretty nice stuff came out of this new freedom. Moore's Swamp Thing, Miller's Daredevil and Batman, Byrne's Superman, and many others. But something else once again reared its ugly head during this decade. The self-righteous began to unfurl the crimson banners of censorship. The Attorney General of the United States instituted a pressure campaign to clean up the magazine market. Born-again TV evangelists did entire shows on the evils of comics. I couldn't help but inject some of these tensions into The Cult. Here we have Deacon Blackfire masquerading as their religious leader, hiding behind moral self, righteousness while he furthers his own personal agenda. I'll admit his goals and methods are a hell of a lot more extreme than the groups that lobby in our state capitol, but they both have one thing in common. They brought Batman to his knees.
Building off these long-standing tensions and cultural anxieties, Starlin sought to craft a tale that would both satirise this moral panic and push the medium and Batman as a character into even more provocative and darker territories than before, all in an attempt to deconstruct one of comics' greatest heroes and re-evaluate what it is that he represents. The debut issue of Batman the Cult hit shelves in August of 1988. Subtitled Ordeal, this issue was unmistakably unique from its now iconic cover, but as a generation of readers curiously turned the page, they would shockingly witness the extent of Starlin and Wrightson's mission to break the Dark Knight. The Cult begins in unexpected fashion. We follow Batman walking through an eerie, dreamlike place before emerging through an unknown door where he encounters the Joker. Joker tries to detonate a bomb that will blow up the city, causing Bruce to attack the Clown Prince of Crime. As he continues to mercilessly beat the villain, Bruce transforms in and out of his costumed alter ego, before picking up an axe and seemingly killing his foe. Just as readers try to comprehend this shocking opening, the comic reveals it to be a nightmare. However, Batman's actual state is hardly any better. We discover that he has been abducted by an unknown group and is being held captive within Gotham's sewers. Batman drifts in and out of consciousness as he surveys his captors, discovering that the majority of them are homeless and work for a mysterious figure named Deacon Blackfire. After being tortured and drugged, Deacon confronts the Dark Knight, explaining his divine mission to save Gotham from its sins through a bloody uprising. Batman tries to fight off Deacon's manipulation, but his followers continue to drug and torment him, causing Bruce to hallucinate as Blackfire preaches his cause. Eventually, after weeks of non-stop torture, Batman seemingly breaks, admitting that Deacon is right and that he now sees the light. Meanwhile, we see a flashback that reveals how the Dark Knight was captured. A month earlier, Commissioner Gordon asked Batman to investigate a series of murders, which then led to him discovering that the city's homeless population has somehow disappeared. Leaving Robin behind, Batman ventured in the sewers to try and find these missing people, only to encounter the cult. While Robin and Gordon search for Batman, Bruce loses all sense of self and stands alongside Blackfire's army. In the book's second issue, Deacon leads his followers, including Batman, out of the sewers, causing a riot throughout the streets. Bruce witnesses Two-Face within the commotion and unloads on the villain with a machine gun, only for the hallucination to slowly wear off, and Batman realises that he shot an innocent man. This moment of realisation breaks Bruce out of his trance, as he grapples with the realisation of what he's done and the extent to which he's been broken. Batman returns to the sewers determined to apprehend Blackfire, but as he enters the villain's lair, he's assaulted by several of his generals. Deacon orders Batman to be executed, but Robin appears out of nowhere and rescues his mentor before this happens. The pair escape the sewers as it's revealed that Blackfire's soldiers have killed the mayor and the city council, with Deacon also hijacking several TV stations and declaring the city belongs to him. The dynamic duo emerge to the surface to find Gotham descending into chaos. Upon reuniting with Alfred, a defeated Batman orders him to drive them as far away as possible, declaring that they have lost and Blackfire now controls Gotham. With Batman seemingly gone, Commissioner Gordon calls a state of emergency, with the city being cornered off by the US military. In the book's final issue, Bruce wakes up in Wayne Manor the following week. Having healed from his injuries and detoxed from the drugs the cult gave him, he and Robin suit up and return to Gotham to stop the villain's crusade. Breaking through the blockade, the heroes arrive to not only find Blackfire's cult fighting the army, but that many of Gotham's poor have actually sided with the cult. Bruce emerges from the vehicle and fights through the crowd, telling the rioters to warn Deacon that Batman is coming. Batman and Robin then make their way into the sewers, where they discover that several of Blackfire's generals have been killed. As they go deeper, Bruce finds Blackfire waiting for him. The villain explains that Batman must kill him to regain the city, but doing so will turn him into a martyr and kickstart an inevitable civil war. The two fight, with Deacon encouraging Batman to use both a gun and a knife, only for the Caped Crusader to refuse and beat Blackfire in front of his followers. As the cult watches, realising he has failed, they begin to swarm their leader. Batman and Robin leave, with Bruce sparing him, but warning that those who Deacon exploited and manipulated may not be so forgiving. With Blackfire now presumed dead, Batman, Robin and Gordon restore order to Gotham City. As the city returns to normal, Batman makes one final journey to the sewers. He returns to the place where he was held captive for so long, and stands in front of a totem constructed in Deacon's image. Reflecting on his greatest failure and how the cult forced him to rise from the ashes, Bruce burns the totem down, ridding the city of Blackfire's last remnants as the Dark Knight is reborn. Almost immediately after the cult's final issue was released in November of 1988, the comic quickly garnered a divisive and polarising legacy. Some fans and critics heavily praised Starlin's dark take on the Caped Crusader, seeing it as a brilliant continuation of the work of prior writers like Alan Moore and Frank Miller, and pushing the boundaries of what problems the Dark Knight can face. On the other hand, some believed that the cult simply went too far, veering too much into shock value and trying to be provocative at the expense of telling a truly engaging story. This debate surrounding the series has continued up to the present day, with readers now still debating the book's status and significance. What can't be debated though is that the cult continued the trend started by Miller of placing Batman into much harsher and more brutal settings. Jim Starlin's Batman owes a lot to The Dark Knight Returns in particular, and the cult could be viewed as something of a spiritual successor to Miller and Klaus Janssen's story. To discuss the similarities between these two books and how Starlin sought to build off Miller's groundbreaking work, here's YouTube's resident Batman expert Salazar Knight to provide some context.
For all intents and purposes, the late 1980s was the time period where the Batman comics truly lost all of their innocence, and the newfound interest in this escalating darkness can be traced back to the publication of The Dark Knight Returns in 1986. Almost every other Batman story created after that was influenced in one way or another by Frank Miller's iconic and groundbreaking take on Batman. And there is no better example of that than the work done by Jim Starlin as the main Batman writer in the late 1980s. It is undeniable that Frank Miller's work on The Dark Knight Returns was essentially the blueprint for the entire Batman run of Jim Starlin. The writer himself has gone on record to say that, "I was never going to be one of the people who would do the Joker takes over Gotham City kind of stories. I wanted a different track, in the vein of how Frank Miller handled Batman. I really loved his version of Batman." Taking a look back at Jim Starlin's Batman, it's inevitable to find all the similarities it has with Miller's version of The Dark Knight. From the use of Cold War politics and the appearance of President Ronald Reagan in 10 Nights of the Beast, to the conflict between Batman and Superman and the death of Robin in A Death in the Family, Jim Starlin's Batman makes it obvious that DC Comics was leaning heavily on the popularity of The Dark Knight Returns. And the most glaring example of that is perhaps the 1988 4-chapter miniseries called Batman the Cult, a story that follows the same publication format of The Dark Knight Returns, as well as many of the same story beats and overall artistic direction. Batman the Cult is also a deep psychological exploration of Batman's motivations and methods, as writer Jim Starlin and artist Bernie Wrightson take the gritty realism of The Dark Knight Returns and combine it with the dark aesthetic of horror fiction to create a story that makes us all wonder just how dark can they make a Batman story before it goes too far.
Continuing this theme of emphasising the dark in The Dark Knight, Starlin and Wrightson's comic is absolutely brutal. It drags the hero to his absolute lowest, showing us a Bruce Wayne completely broken by Deacon Blackfire's manipulation. Years before Bane would physically wreck the Caped Crusader, this was arguably the most vulnerable we had ever seen Batman, and it remains one of the character's most shocking moments to date. Combined with Starlin's gritty plot and tone, artist Bernie Wrightson gives the cult a distinct horror-inspired feel. It's a truly harrowing book, with moments like Robin finding Batman chained atop a pile of human corpses, feeling like a literal nightmare come to life. Despite the initial controversy surrounding the cult, Jim Starlin did initially intend to write a follow-up miniseries. However, after his pitch was rejected by DC, it later evolved into his 1991 Marvel series, Punisher POV. In the meantime though, Starlin continued to write the main monthly Batman title. In late 1988 and early 1989, he and Jim Aparo told A Death in the Family. This now infamous story, told within the pages of Batman issue 426 to 429, saw the death of Jason Todd, the second Robin, at the hands of the Joker, and not only changed the Dark Knight status quo forever, but firmly entrenched the character in the darker and somber corners of superhero storytelling. Switching gears back to the cult though, I find this to be a really fascinating series, even if, despite reading it numerous times over the years, I'm still not fully sure how I feel about it. I don't think it stands as one of my absolute favourite Batman books, but I do think it's quite ahead of its time, and had a very obvious impact on the future direction of Batman comics throughout the late 80s and the 1990s. I don't think you get stories like No Man's Land, Nightfall and Night Cries without Starlin and Wrightson's dark, deconstructive tale. With that said though, there's certainly an argument that Starlin takes this approach too far, breaking Batman so much that he would never quite feel the same again. I do admire the writer's dedication to pushing the boundary of what is acceptable to its absolute limit, especially in the context of increased moral panic against superhero stories. As someone who's read even more Batman books than I have, I asked Salazar Knight what his opinion on the cult is, and how it may have changed in the years since he first read this series.
Looking back at Batman the Cult, I can vividly remember the first time I read this book. I was very new to comics and I was quite overwhelmed by the terrifying art of Bernie Wrightson. Back then, I was definitely not prepared to appreciate the work of one of the masters of horror comics, but now I can see that the art is precisely the greatest thing about the story. The Batman of Bernie Wrightson strikes a great balance between the dark creature of the night and the resourceful crime fighter, which works rather well in the context of this story. His heavy use of shadows and the detailed line art of his work create this perfect blend of horror fiction and human tragedy that makes the art of the cult stand out among many other contemporary Batman stories. Unfortunately, the art is only half of the equation, and the other half is simply not on the same level. Of course, I'm talking about the writing of Jim Starlin, which at first made me uncomfortable with the levels of grotesque violence all throughout the storyline, which really made me not want to revisit the story at all. But after forcing myself to go back through the story a couple more times over the years, I eventually understood that what I really didn't like about it is the fact that it completely broke Batman. And I'm not talking about how Batman is captured and chained up in the sewers, where he is starved, drugged and brainwashed until he becomes an obedient zombie that kills people in the name of Deacon Blackfire. As terrible as all of that is just the setup to show us later how this experience truly broke Batman, not just physically but psychologically. In the final chapters, Batman not only considers giving up on Gotham, but there's also a moment where he watches an innocent person die in front of him, and he just sits there in the safety of his monster bat truck, paralyzed in fear and doing nothing to save them. This moment happens in the final chapter, where Batman makes a grand comeback, fully recovered and ready to defeat the bad guys, only to then let this happen, making it pretty obvious that Batman was still broken. His body might have recovered, but his spirit never did.
Although it's hard for me to disagree with a lot of Salazar's contentions, I still find The Cult to be quite a curious and intriguing series. For all of its excessive gore, violence and shock value, it's ultimately a book about Batman's resilience, and how no matter how you break him physically, mentally or even spiritually, he always finds a way to rise again and overcome any circumstance. Whether or not this approach actually works in the context of the story is up for debate, but I'm glad that this book exists to push the boundaries of what a Batman comic book can be, and how it raised several interesting and uncomfortable questions about both DC's Caped Crusader and the state of comic books as they continued to get darker and grittier in the late 80s and beyond. For better or worse, The Cult remains one of Batman's most provocative and ambitious adventures, and the fact that now, some 37 years after its release, it still generates so much passionate debate speaks to the story's enduring legacy and its role in defining Batman's modern status quo. Irrespective of how you might feel, it's hard to argue that The Cult isn't a bold and unapologetic story that tests the boundaries of what is considered too far in a mainstream superhero comic. And it's this that's ultimately cemented it as not just one of Batman's darkest moments, but one of the most controversial tales in the character's entire history. Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please make sure to leave a like on this video and leave a comment down below as well. Let me know your thoughts on everything we talked about in today's video. I can't wait to hear what you have to say as always. If you're new to Owen Likes Comics, please make sure to hit the subscribe button and the notify bell so you don't miss out on any future videos. And if you enjoyed this and you want some more, there should be some other videos on screen right now that you might also enjoy. If you want to help support the channel and help me make more videos, you can do so by going to patreon.com/OwenLikesComics, or if you just want some more of me, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram and Blue Sky, just at Owen Likes Comics. I also want to give a big thank you to Salazar Knight for joining me in this video. If you love video essays about comics and you love Batman, his channel is the perfect place for you, and I will leave links in the descriptions to where you can follow him and keep up to date with all of his work. But that's all for this video. Again, thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and hopefully I will see you next time. But until then, take care and keep reading.